dive in, and we will get going.
I'll try to see how the sound goes.
It's great. It sounds very good.
If it goes well, I'll stay.
Well, glad you all are here tonight. This is our fourth part in the series that, again, was a direct response to request. It took me a while to get here. It's probably 2 years ago somebody asked me to do this, the early history of the human. Just from a functional point of view, I told Becca this. I'm sure she sent it in the email to the Westminster community, but we will not meet next week. And then the week after that, we begin a whole series of guests coming in. Now, the next two sessions will be me, and we're going to spend some time, I think, because that's what I was working on when my daughter called. My daughter called, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm kind of looking at some things relative to Rome, but not so much Rome specifically, but Rome in the greater context of where we will be tonight." You're going to see, we're going to kind of look and spend some time in some of the early civilizations that we've been talking around and in their aspects. And we're going to look at some of those civilizations in kind of the broad approach. And so I got to where we'll see, hopefully if I get to where I want to get tonight, we'll end up with Persia. And that's always on the cusp of the Greco-Persian Wars. And I just find it interesting to start looking at the juxtaposition of the great city-states and the powers that kind of play out in about a 400-year run. And so I thought that would be interesting. But hopefully, I think I put it in the email to everyone, but over the next really 3 months, I've got some wonderful peers who are going to come join us. And we'll be talking about some aspects of literature, math, history, civil rights, some ancient, some modern. I'm really excited about the rest of the spring and can't wait to spend some time with you in that process. And I will be here with you every night, as always, and looking forward. So we're going to kind of dive right on in, but we're going to start actually with a quote from John Adams. So John Adams is my favorite president. And for Christmas, I was given his collection of writings. It's actually 3 volumes. So I'm reading through volume 1. And his quote that I love the most is this one that he wrote in 1772. So after the Boston Massacre, when he kind of had more of a step into fame by defending the soldiers, but before the First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, when he really ramped up. And so he wrote a document called Oration on Government. And I thought it was just kind of, I love this quote and I wanted to share it with you, and then I'll tie it into you guys. He says, "The preservation of liberty depends upon the intellectual and moral character of the people. As long as knowledge and virtue are diffused generally or widely among the body of a nation, it is impossible that they should be enslaved. This, being enslaved, can be brought to pass only by debasing their understandings or by corrupting their hearts." And so I just wanted to read that to you because I love John, but I also wanted to use it as a commendation to yourselves as being a people who, at whatever age you are still somewhat interested in knowledge, the gaining of knowledge. And what Adams meant, maybe I'll spend a whole session on just on John Adams. That'd be fun for me. I was interviewed about 5 weeks ago, and the interviewer wanted to do John Adams. We ended up talking for almost 2 hours. So it's a very long podcast. If you'd like me to send you a link to that podcast, it's not my podcast, but I'm more than happy to send it to you. But anyway, I could do John Adams for a long time. But I wanted to commend you for being a kind of people who focus on the kind of grasping and the expansion of knowledge. And that was really my intent when I asked Becca to start this. Mr. Van Horn and I had this idea. I thought it'd be a really fun way to continue to challenge your intellect, which for many of you is considerable, and at the same time present information that maybe you hadn't thought about in a while, or maybe hadn't heard of in a while, and it would be good for you. I think John Adams would be pleased with us in our continued effort to learn. Like I said, I was on the phone with my daughter, called, and she said, "What are you doing?" And I could have shortly said, "Well, I'm trying to learn more because I was trying to put together some information about Rome." And I think I've told you, Antiquity is not my strongest field, forte. Don't have as strong as a general grasp with information. So like you, I love to learn and go dig back in. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to expand on what we've done the first 3 nights. So for 3 sessions here in January, we've spent time looking at antiquity and looking at society and civilizations in antiquity. We talked about how historians know anything when you're 6,500 years back. How can we possibly know if that stuff's valuable? And we found that the historical narrative that we have is remarkably secure, even though there are some times and some stories where we would love to have more information. The story that we have in the continued discoveries, both in manuscript evidence and in archaeological or corroborative evidence, just continues to firm up our sense of the story. We're not getting new stories like that guy named Julius Caesar. His real name was Mark. I mean, we're not finding that kind of information. There really was a man named Julius Caesar. He really did do the things and operate in the storyline that we know in that sense. And then we looked more broadly at kind of what are some of the takeaways from antiquity that we can grasp for our own day. And I think that's one of the things I like about Adams, is I kind of have his book here on my desk of his writings, is that he was somebody who was passionate, as were many of the founders. And I don't mean the famous founders, I mean the average people who were alive in that 1750 to 1800 time period, that produced just such an amazing array of leaders, of informed people. That was the best way to put it. And they were very well versed in the human species built off of lessons from antiquity. And then the last session we looked at is specifically, as again was requested alongside this topic of the general human species, is the why for religion. And that we saw then that all peoples, there literally is nobody in antiquity where this is not true. The idea today that you have a growing percentage, mostly of young people, who would claim to have no interest in spirituality or have a connection to atheism, which basically would say that there just isn't a God whatsoever, and that percentage is growing, would be an aberration to the historical story. Doesn't mean they're wrong necessarily. It just means when you look and compare our own day to that of the bulk of history, you can see that there's an aberration there. So we said, well, why? Why was that true? And we saw common stories and common issues, as well as some of the uniquenesses of these people. So I kind of wanted to just then stop and say, okay, so then let's take a look at the geopolitical structures that get set up in our story. And I covered this with you before, that we start at this time period known as the Bronze Age. So if you have done your own reading, you know, of course, that there, while debated, there's a sense in which there are multiple years prior to this. So when you see first civilizations, and we talk about the four rivers, the four cradles of civilization, and I showed you a slide on day one about that. It's not so much that historians, or at least this historian, is suggesting that there isn't time before that. It seems pretty clear that there is, and there is evidence of the human species operating in some capacity prior to this. But for me, at least, the role of the historian starts with where the evidence begins. Prior to that, it's just an opinion. So for instance, I would say that there's several places that we can look at and say that we know there are people there. There seems clearly to have been some lived experience there. In some cases, they left us tools. In some cases, they left art on cave walls and other places, but we don't know anything about them. And this is true, by the way, after these four civilizations begin here. So there are people groups that we know, say in North America, that we feel very confident were in existence, certainly in the 1500 BC time period, but because there's no written language, we don't have the evidence for them. So this is the four that we typically start with. And from Western civilization's point of view, the way we teach our class also, is you focus in on the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. So these rivers here, we've looked at this slide before. So here's the Nile, obviously very famous and familiar for everyone. Some of you may have visited. I've never been there, but some of you may have visited. And then over here in modern day Iraq is the Tigris and the Euphrates, two separate rivers. But here in this kind of middle spot where you see Babylon and Uruk, you can see they're relatively close together. So there's a little, I mean, it's not very close, but they're relatively close. And so civilization really developing here, then also on the upper reaches, which we'll come back to more in a moment. You may know that this area here, that's all in yellow, is largely desert or very difficult living conditions pre-modern times. So civilization up and down the Nile, civilization up and down the Tigris and Euphrates, and then growing from there. Now, we're not going to spend any time on Egypt and Babylon for a variety of reasons, but I do like to point out a couple of different things for them. Again, first writing, some of our first scientific developments. And when you look at the first writing and scientific developments, one of the things is we begin to gain an idea of how the human society organized itself. And I pointed this out to you in week 2, and that you can see as you study history from its beginning to end, that the human is in a constant debate with itself over what's the best for the society. And there's a variety of avenues to go down that road, but one of those is what's best for our size. How are we best organized from a size point of view? And historically, you'll see kind of a pendulum movement between very large versus very small. And I love the fact when you look and you kind of just start our story and we start with Egypt and we start with the Mesopotamian Valley, you can see both right off the bat. Pendulum's not, I don't like pendulum, although I think maybe that's a way to say it, because there's always expressions of both. So you can sort of see it in our own country, right? Are you better living in a state like California, New York, Florida, Texas? Or are you better living in a state like Rhode Island or Delaware or North Dakota with small population in all three, small geography in the first two? Which one of those is better? And you'll get debates and discussions. There's not a right from a sense of, I don't think anybody could claim that this is it. It's just perspective. However, I think one can look back and see positives and negatives that both groups provide. With Egypt, we see a swirling history around their empire between division and civil war, basically. And it's typically stated in like 3 large kingdom periods, roughly 400 to 500 years each. So that's telling also, because it seems as if we as a species, maybe it's that we get bored with the norm, but regardless, there's a moment in which chaos brings in a moment of change. In Mesopotamia, though, it's interesting, is that their history is much more volatile. And there's some sense in which both of those ideas, the Egyptians having stability with seasons of some upheaval, and the Mesopotamians constantly being in some version of turmoil, reflects their rivers. So if you do a lot more study in both ancient societies, the Nile floods regularly. It allowed the Egyptians to develop a series of developments around agriculture, trade, economy, based on the fact that they knew typically how the Nile would react yearly. Whereas in the city-states of the Mesopotamian Valley, the Tigris and Euphrates are much more random in their flooding. And we saw that with their religions, that reflected for the Mesopotamians, both their view of death and their view of their gods, and the Egyptians similarly. So you saw a reflection in the process. Again, why with these guys? Why do we start here? Well, we start here because of the writing. So the Egyptians developed a pictorial writing of hieroglyphics, which I think is fair to say does point backwards, so to a pre-writing, or often called a pre-history time period. And we know from, more famously, the cave drawings, that those might not have been artworks. They might have been some sort of storytelling, but the Egyptians became very ornate and very developed in their writing with hieroglyphics. At the same time, in the Mesopotamian Valley, they developed cuneiform. And so cuneiform looks more familiar to us, though there's not letters by any stretch of the imagination. It's kind of marks and almost geometric shapes. If you know your Chinese writing or you know Hebrew writing, you see that same sort of similarity where they're not letters, they are to somebody who reads Hebrew or Chinese, or which, Mandarin, or which version of Chinese you might read. But nonetheless, to the outsider, it's just sort of marks of some kind, and cuneiform is in that. We don't have, with hieroglyphics, you don't have as many like small writing samples. I'm not certain that means they couldn't do it in a smaller version. They could have, but most of what we have is on walls or in big sections of what were cities of that time. Whereas with the cuneiform, these are small. You could put this in your hand and hold it. And in various city-states in the Mesopotamian Valley, we have these preserved for us because of fire that allowed the clay tablets to be hardened. In fact, I was just reading in the past couple of months, where was I reading this? I might have just been online, but it was a current scholar is doing work through refuse garbage dumps from some of the ancient city-states of the Mesopotamian Valley, because what would happen a lot of times is these pottery shards, what we would call pottery shards, with these writing pieces would be used and reused. So if they were clay, you could sort of soften it enough to sort of wipe the writing off and start over. By finding these pieces that were, discarded, we've been able to find some more interesting writing. In fact, one of the things that the historian was talking about was that more women, she found evidence of women in leadership, or women who were running their own families, much like I told you about was true for the Romans. So that's interesting. And that's an example of how we continue to find evidence to sustain the narrative and broaden the story that we have. Well, as we go through these, one of the things the Mesopotamians bring to us is they begin to start seeing consolidation. So if Mesopotamia starts off as small city-states, it begins to consolidate. And this is a truism that I think you can see historically. In fact, if you look at our country, I think you can see the early colonization. So our 13 colonies, and then technically in 76, the British colonies, there were 15 because there was Florida and there was Quebec. We're in one sense small, independent from each other. And one of the points we make when we talk about the American Revolution is there was no sense of a national unity until we sort of just made that up in 76, brought on by the events of 1763 to 1765. And so you see that often. You see it in Greece with the small city-states, the Italian peninsula, small city-states, that when you get to the small, there's almost always some force that moves to the large. Now, it seems like that happens most of the time through conquest. So here, the Akkadians and then the Amorites, it's not like they were voted in or not like there was a selection, there was warfare. And so the city-states, much like Athens does, and then Sparta versus Athens, and the smaller city-states in the Greek area are under the dominion of those, more powerful nations, is a way to understand it. One of the things I like about bringing up King Hammurabi is that he brings us law codes. And so one of the things that I pointed out to you in week 2 is that we do have the question of law, and is law written? And I think I told you that day I was going to show you this pole is what's called the Hammurabi stele. And it is one of, in the picture you can see there, this is in Paris, where I took the picture. But I think there's a dozen of these that still are in existence. And what it is on this pole, it's about 7 to 8 feet high. And there are, at least this one has 17 sections that are about 2 inches in height. I'm gonna come back to this picture, but you can see a close-up shot here. Can you see, if you look really closely, if you can see on the screen or on your slide, there's a line going that way horizontally, and then there's another one up here, and there's another one up here, and then there's the lines going down this way. And much like the cuneiform that we saw, the writing is inside each one. And it seems to me like this is either a specific law or perhaps some version of a sentence. I think they did read it right to left, but they could have read it top to bottom. And I don't know the answer to that question. But it was real fascinating when I saw this. I spent a long time looking at the stele because Hammurabi, I'm fascinated with him, because one of the core aspects that we have talked about in my class, but I brought it up for you as well, is the idea of understanding law. Is law provided? Is it written? Is it not written? So like we know, for instance, the Hittites, the Israelis, the Hebrews, Hammurabi, and the Amorites, they have a written law. The Egyptians, we don't have an evidence of a written law, though we do have some documents that clearly let us know that there was law, but we don't have like a code, kind of a codified kind of way. So it's fascinating to me to think about, and then as you go through studying history, the fascination is what you can see in the moments when there either is written law or there is not written law. That when there is not written law, that is almost always a time when you can measure human rights or the rights of the citizens being in decline, that the average person having very little recourse in which to act. In fact, one of the things that my friend, Professor Dr. Lindsay McNells, who's going to come speak to us, I think it's in March, she's going to come and join us, and her expertise is in the Middle Ages, but her focus is on the average person and their relationship to the law. And her dissertation was on that. I know she'll spend some time talking about that. And the feudal period of the Middle Ages is one of those times where the written law kind of disappears. And you have some written law, but in general terms, the average peasant does not have the same rights. Here in this time period of Hammurabi, if you thought the law was being broken, you could walk up to the center of a town or in the corner of a town, and you could point out the law to whoever the authorities were. I kind of wish we would do that. We might get shorter laws instead of the thousands of pages that get written now for us in Congress and the things that they do. Here to get close-up shot, then this is an even closer shot. Just wanted you to see, it's a little blurry, but I wanted you to be able to see that. I kind of wish I could read cuneiform, or we have copies in English or of other languages of Hammurabi's code. I wish I had a way to track down which part of the code this is, just because it's fascinating to me. Okay, so I mentioned the other moment ago, we were going to look at the upper reaches. So when you start looking at the development of these larger societies, the Hittites are the next group that kind of comes in after the Akkadians and the Amorites. But the Akkadians and the Amorites were in the lower part, or near modern day Kuwait, modern day Iraq. The Hittites are in the upper part, the upper reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates. And as you can see, really more accurately, they're connected to Anatolia or Asia Minor, to that area there. They become established for us around 1500, 1600, and they become a factor in the story of this region. But what I think is most interesting with the Hittites is that they provide us a break or an introduction to one of the great mysteries of history. There's several mysteries, although some of the things we call mysteries, we have a pretty good idea of. But one of the great mysteries of antiquity is a group of people called the Sea People, S-E-A, the Sea People. And I mentioned the Sea People in this context because the Hittites, they had established themselves in the Central Asia Minor, and as you can see, had developed and kind of moved their way over to the Aegean. Now, at that point in the Aegean, the Minoan culture on Crete would have been the dominant power. So they were not going to be in a place that they could somehow overtake the Minoans as far as in their kind of conquest. But in this upper corner here of the modern day Cyprus, and up here in this corner of the Mediterranean Sea, the Hittites were dominant. And they were not an insignificant people group. These are the military superpowers of the moment. And then they literally just vanish. And they vanish, why? Because of the Sea Peoples. Now, I just told you a moment ago that when we do our work in history, we feel very confident about the narrative that we know. However, as I also said, there are things that we wish we knew a lot more about. And this is one of the great mysteries. This one fascinates me, and I hope some young historian or some old historian discovers something that illuminates this for us. We can start with the Hittites. The Hittites are the dominant superpower, and then they vanish. They just disappear from our story. It's as if they were just wiped out, and they will be replaced, as I'm about to show you, by the Assyrians, who are probably more familiar to most of you. You say, well, did the Assyrians conquer the Hittites? Nope, there's no evidence of that. Similarly, if you look at Greece, and I mentioned this when we talked about Athens, I think back in December, but just briefly, there are three time periods when we kind of consider Greece. One of them is between the group that fights the Trojan War and then the more famous period of Athens and Sparta and Corinth and Thebes in classical Greece with the gods and Delphi and the Greco-Persian War. The period between those two times, so the Mycenaean period and then the classical period, is called the Dark Ages. It's a couple hundred years long. And people are like, well, what happened? And the answer, much like with Hittites, is we don't know. However, there's evidence of the sea peoples in Greece as well. In fact, there's some suggestion that these people emerged first in the land north of Greece. So I guess basically modern day Albania or the Balkans, and then just sort of show up and then destruction's in their wake. They're not the only people group like this. You might say, wait, that sounds a lot like the Mongolians. Yes, it does. And it'll be much like the Assyrians, as I'll show you in just a second. But we know them mostly because we do have a record of them in Egypt. In fact, for a while, centuries of study, nobody knew what had happened. It was just sort of like, there's this people and they disappeared. And then again, we try to further our narrative. In Egypt, we found some documents that basically talked about how in this time period of say 1200, there was an invasion of Egypt from the sea, and they called them the sea people. So that's not a made up term by historians just trying to be cute. The Egyptians said there's this group called the sea peoples, and the Egyptians say and seemingly were able to defeat them and keep them from invading, but it seemed to have deflected them to the kind of northeast away from Egypt into modern day Palestine, Israel area, Lebanon, Jordan, that section of space there. The sea peoples are a fascinating one. We don't know much about them other than the fact that there seems to be destruction and the end of certain civilizations in their wake as they would come through. Well, so then if you think this, the Hittites, then once the sea peoples come through, this opens the door for other groups to emerge, right? So one of the smaller groups that emerged is Phoenicia. Now, Phoenicia was one of the really interesting ones for us because they're the one group that you don't have a lot of evidence of warfare. And I thought to suggest that ancient peoples were at war all the time, although it may feel that way. I think perhaps more fairly, the human is at war all the time, like Thomas Hobbes said. I always find it interesting when people are trying to promote our own time and some of the successes or supposed successes of the United Nations and post-World War II. People will say, well, we haven't had a war since 1945. And I'm like, all to the contrary, the world and the United States has basically been at war every day since 1945. There's just not been a major, what we call a major war between the major powers like Germany and England or Russia and the United States. But there's certainly been war everywhere. So the fact that these guys were at war a lot isn't somehow a mark against them as people or civilizations. But the Phoenicians are really one of our first groups to introduce the power of trade. And because of their location on the coast and their focus on economy, and I think kind of a relationship to the Minoan culture, which was also a trading-based culture, kind of moving goods and people around, the Phoenicians were able to find enough wealth to sort of buy their independence from the more localized nearby powers that would have been threatening for them. And they really will exist all the way down in some form or another to the coming of the Romans. They will plant trading cities. Most famously on the far western part of the Mediterranean is the city of Carthage, which in Phoenician was new city. And so they plant a new city on the far west, and there's suggestion then from Carthage, certainly the Carthaginians will move into Iberia, modern day Spain. There's some suggestion that the Carthaginians will exit the Mediterranean and sail in the Atlantic. I don't know, I don't know of any evidence to suggest they go as far north as Ireland or France or as far south as, beneath the hump of Africa. But nonetheless, they were a trading people who moved and were like a middleman, an economic kind of country that could support things. One of the things most important for us is that Phoenicia gives us the foundation for a connection to the Greek alphabet, which ultimately becomes the foundation for the alphabet of most of Western civilization as we know it, moving away from the more kind of pictorial type of shape. There's Phoenicia as far as on the coastline. Tyre down here is really probably their most famous city, and it'll still be rolling till the Greeks, Alexander, destroys it. Here's where Carthage is located, and again, as you can see, they get to this lower part. By the time of the Punic Wars, which is in the 240s, 250s, down to 150 time period, most of the Mediterranean side of Iberia is colonized and peopled by the Carthaginians. This, of course, brings us to, from the other side of the coin, if the Phoenicians are the people who are traders and not warlike, the Philistines are the ones who kind of carry forward this idea of warfare that we associated with the Sea Peoples and to some degree with the Hittites. There's no clarity amongst historians at this point, but it seems that there's a possible connection to the Sea People, that maybe the Philistines are direct descendants of, perhaps that they might be the legacy of that lost battle with the Egyptians, that rather than going home, perhaps they didn't have a home per se. Remember the conversation of settled versus nomadic peoples, and that they then were so few, maybe they could not have continued what had been their process, and they settled. We don't have the Philistines or evidence of the Philistines in this area of the Mediterranean, the Eastern Med, near Egypt prior to this. So there's this sort of they emerge at this moment. We know them best from their continued war with the Israeli people. And once the Israeli people come back, remember our story from last time, is they come to, from their point of view, come back home. I would say from the people who lived there at the time of the coming of Joshua and the Jewish people, they just were this invasion force who just showed up into Palestine and took over. But the Philistines become this people group that are kind of the yin and yang of the Israeli peoples. It's interesting that it is in their lands that we get the first introduction or first evidence of introduction of both grapevines and olive trees, which again, that connects back to what we said with the Sea Peoples, that there's possibly some evidence that they came down from modern day Greece, whether they were Greek, that they probably were not Greek, but if they came through Greece, grapes and olives would be something that they could have brought with them in kind of an ongoing process. When you look at nomadic peoples, it's not like you and me on the road and we just hope we run into a McDonald's. These people, these tribal peoples would carry everything with them so that they would go from one area to another. Some of them, like our own Native American peoples who we know to be nomadic, traveling in right through an area of land that they understood as their land, but it was a large circle today, like maybe 5 or 6 states worth of land kind of moving around. As opposed to, there are other nomadic peoples who traveled over vast distances and almost never returned back to certain locations. It's possible the Sea People are like that. Having mentioned the Israelis, here's a map, of course, and you can see Tyre and Phoenicia to the north, the kingdom of Israel, kingdom of Judah, that's actually later. Just imagine both the green and the yellow as one thing. And then Philistia, where the Philistines were down, Gaza, which of course is pretty familiar to most people today, being their location. And you remember the map, then this is on the way down to where you would run into Egypt in that section. So we mentioned King Saul last time, and then we left him and we went back in time, and we were spending most of our time looking at the religion, and you kind of had to tie in the religion of the Jewish people with their national narrative story. But so picking up from where we left off, there's a moment where they've come back, and remember there were the 12 tribes. So these tribal peoples are living in some large connection, but very loose. And it's a period they know as the time of leadership of the judges. Well, they decided they didn't like that. As they looked around at other peoples, why don't we have a king? So they choose a king, and it's this man Saul. He is moderately successful, but you can see he's only king for a short time. Now, ultimately, he's killed in battle with the Philistines, along with his own son, Jonathan. But prior to that, there's a civil war that emerges underneath him because of a connection to a son, his son's friend, David, who you may have heard of. David is not in the royal bloodline. If we think of Saul being the first king, so the royal bloodline, David replaces Saul. There's a civil war where it's kind of there's a moment where factions are picking sides after Saul's death. Then clearly, after his death, then clearly David is the person chosen to be the leader. David will expand the kingdom, maintaining that conflict with the Philistine people. He's the one who moves the capital, Jerusalem, but he makes some choices that end up causing internal revolt. His son Solomon will have to bear the brunt of these decisions and the kind of the failure of the king David, as well as of Solomon, I would suggest, leading to more conflict. There's obviously a lot more to the story than this, but there's a brief moment when these smaller kingdoms of Phoenicia, Philistia, and Israel are kind of a break between Egypt, which still is a massive power at this point, and what's developing to their north, Assyria. Ultimately, as that last map showed you, Israel splits, and it has another civil war, and it divides. When Solomon dies, or when he comes into power, is a better way to put it, there's a request basically for him to lower the tax burden. He doesn't. He's building a massive empire. The kingdom is as large as it ever will be. He has pretty oppressive taxation, and he, becomes well known for his trade far and wide, but in his buildings, and he will build a massive temple for their God. It's a very expensive thing. When he passes, the fact that he hasn't really solved the problems of his own father will lead to a civil war that splits the kingdom. And from that point on, there are the two kingdoms, as the map shows here, of Israel, which is the northern part, and then Judah, which is the southern part. That's important to keep in mind with where we're going to go, because who comes into our story are the Assyrians. So the Assyrians become the replacement, you could say, for the Hittites. There is some interaction between the Hittites and the Assyrians. So when I said the Hittites disappeared, I don't want to suggest they just completely vanished. But what we have is the story, much like in Mycenae, where there seems to be just success and power, and then the record just falls silent. And there's no evidence from an archaeological point of view of a continuation. So you have to see people show up. And then in the 9th century, in the upper reaches of the Tigris and the Euphrates, around the city of Nineveh, this people group emerges. Adad Nerari II is obviously second, so there's somebody before him, but he's considered really the leader, the George Washington, you might say, of the rise of what's known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And as you can see here on the map, it's going to become a dominant power. So again, from a point of view of just understanding geographically where we are, remember here's the Nile. And even though this map will show in a light green a suggestion that the Assyrians have somehow conquered Egypt, that's not correct. It shouldn't suggest that they'd conquered Egypt, rather that they had an influence when Egypt is in some decline, I think is a good way to put it. Similarly, as we were just saying, here you've got these smaller nations right here in the along the the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean. And they still have their own independence at this point. But the Assyrians are going to be growing in this kind of upper reaches of this area. They'll expand into some of the land the Hittites had and become really a dominant power. In fact, you could arguably say they are the most dominant power, even more so than the more famous Babylon. What's really interesting is Babylon, both in religious writings and to some degree, I think historically, go down in our minds as like the power. And yet their time on the stage was actually quite short and a little volatile. The Assyrians are actually the more powerful, more dominant empire, civilization in this early period of our kind of global history. Part of what drove their success post Sea Peoples was they were the first to really move us from the Bronze to the Iron Age. So they gained a technological advantage, both in weaponry and in economy. And because of this, they're going to develop an industry around warfare, perhaps similar to what we have post-World War II with the military-industrial complex idea, in which they will be mass producing weapons. So they not only have better weapons than all of their, contemporary opponents around them, but they mass produce the weapons. And to some degree, like the Spartans, like the Mongolians, they will embrace as an ethos a warfare or warlike position. So unlike some other people groups for which war is a unfortunate necessity, and you might have some professional soldiers, but most everybody else is not involved in warfare. There are other people groups that we run across through our history in which warfare is glorified to some degree, but also normalized within the society. And I think that's what you could say for the Assyrians. There's no shortage of young men, young Assyrian men, eager to go to war for the expansion of their kingdom. And the Assyrians become well known for their brutality in their warfare. So much like the Mongolians have a real track record of brutality. There's nobody writing about the Mongolians of a contemporary nature who have positive things to say in their time period. The Comanche in our own kingdom, I'm pointing this way because of where North America would be from Western civilization at this point. The Comanche equally were a people group who were reviled by basically everybody they interacted with for their brutality. And the Assyrians were this way also. You may know the story in the Bible, the Jewish Bible, of Jonah. And so that's just one story, one of many actually, where the various people groups interact with have a negative point of view. Clearly the Assyrians didn't see it this way. Neither did the Mongolians, neither did the Comanche. So obviously it's in the perspective of the receiver, right? But when you pay attention to it, there's certainly some stories in which there's a brutality to their work. I think I like these guys, and I mentioned this guy a lot. Tiglath-Pileser is one of my favorite names of history. And I'll tell the students when we're in the course, because this course that we do, Western Civ 2000, so the first one, the ancient one, goes all the way through the 1640s. So the coming of the kingdoms in Europe, of France and Spain. And I said, when we have the war of the three Henrys, and you're desperately trying to keep straight who all the Henrys are that you heard, you're going to wish one of these guys was named Tiglath-Pileser. I keep trying to convince one of the students they should name their son Tiglath-Pileser. In any case, he and Sargon are two of the kings who kind of move the story forward for the Assyrians, kind of taking themselves to a place where they're just conquering. Tiglath-Pileser is the one who will conquer Israel. So the Assyrians take out, to some degree, the Phoenicians, although Tyre will still exist, and have a trading relationship. Again, that trading relationship that allows the Phoenicians to sort of still hang on in the face of the coming of Assyria. The Israelis, and to some degree the Philistines, although they're further south, so they don't really get impacted as much. They'll get theirs in a moment. They can't really confront the Assyrians. Sargon II, and then after Sargon, Sennacherib. Ashurbanipal is one of the last ones who's really going to make a huge mark. Sennacherib's most famous for continuing the invasion down the coast, kind of making his way towards Egypt. He does invade Judah, but is not successful in conquering Jerusalem. He does go the other direction and destroy Babylon, which is a city that has been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. This is one of these interesting moments. So one of the, that you can say, wow, the Assyrians made an interesting choice. When you study the Assyrian warfare method, typically what they would do if they didn't kill everybody in the place, which is, again, that's what the Mongolians did as well, is that they would take the entire population and leave. Now, later, when we get to the Babylonians, for instance, to put that in context, the Babylonians would take the best and brightest, the sons and daughters of the wealthy, perhaps. They wouldn't even take the wealthy old people like me. They'd leave them behind because they're going to die soon anyway, probably. They would take older leaders, but they would take like the best and brightest and then leave everybody else to kind of just fend for themselves. There's no record, say, for the Egyptians of them doing that at all. In fact, the Persians do just the opposite. They don't seem to take anybody captive. They basically conquered and then, left the people there knowing, don't rebel or you'll suffer some consequences. There's no real evidence amongst the Persians, for instance, of capturing and mass migration. The Assyrians do the mass migration thing, but this moment when they destroy Babylon, they don't do that. They don't take everybody with them. And so this becomes part of their story because having left a remnant behind, Babylon will rebuild, and this will become a jumping off point for the Babylonian Empire, which we're about to get to. Ashurbanipal is the one who builds a very famous library at Nineveh. And while he is certainly a warrior king like the others and will continue to press down, so now he is going to go both down to Egypt and has several wars with Egypt. He never conquers Egypt, but certainly is the dominant power in the story. But he goes eastward to Persia and will conquer Susa. So back to this map for a moment, where I'm at here. You can see the expansion here. So here's the Tigris and the Euphrates. Over here is Susa. So this is the part of the story we've not really focused on. It was the land of the Medes and the Persians. So two different people group that are kind of on this modern day Iran, obviously, that are over here in this section. So the Assyrians now kind of moving east. And what you can see when you go back here, particularly when you look at, well, the Hittites all the way back to here. Sorry, too many slides, but just showing to you, if we start saying the development along the Tigris and Euphrates, well, here at the upper part of the Tigris and Euphrates, the very small kingdom. Then if you come back down to the Assyrians, they're basically pushing down to some degree, down towards the modern day Kuwait, for instance, and over towards Persia, but getting a larger expression is the point. Well, after Ashurbanipal, you come to the Babylonians. The Babylonians will take this and step it up a further notch. So now we get a little larger group. The very famous Nebuchadnezzar is the main leader who comes, and his family leads the revenge journey against Assyria. And they will successfully conquer Nineveh, destroy it, and establish, I think it's just the Babylonian Empire. You'll find some historians who do call it the Neo-Babylonian Empire. There was certainly city of Babel and Babylon, as we've talked about. But it was really more of a small city-state and not really a significant in the story as we've talked about the various groups that come along there. Unfortunately for the Babylonians, they don't have the success of continuing. They're a great example of what you will see as you study human history, where a certain leader shows up with a remarkable skill set. Nebuchadnezzar is that both politically and militarily. He seems to be someone who could be up there with other great military political leaders, right? So Napoleon is that way. George Washington is that way. There's others who are great military leaders, the George Pattons, the Julius Caesars. Octavian would be in this group, right? Both a great military leader, but a great political leader. But then in Nebuchadnezzar's case, there's no seeming ability for him to pass that on through his own bloodline. And so the Babylonian Empire is really short-lived compared to the others that we're talking about around it. However, Nebuchadnezzar is successful in expanding this kind of footprint of the empire. He wins the very important Battle of Carchemish in 605, which it's really defeating Egypt, but Judah, the leftover legacy piece of Israel after the northern kingdom was conquered, had thrown its lot in with the Egyptians, even though their God had told them not to. The Egyptians and Judea alliance was defeated by the Babylonians, and ultimately Nebuchadnezzar will control. He won't control all of Egypt, but he'll control enough of the lower part, or the part nearest the Mediterranean, all the way up to Asia Minor. Here's a map. All the way up to Asia Minor, and then significantly all over in modern day Iran. So the Babylonian Empire is expanding. You can see he's expanding. He really has controlled Tyre. He's taken Gaza. So the Philistines, they have disappeared from the story, just like the Israelis have. When I say disappeared, obviously, again, you may know your Bible stories best, and you know that there will be an Israel after Nebuchadnezzar, just like there's an Egypt after Nebuchadnezzar, or there's an Egypt after Alexander, but they're not independent. From this point forward, Israel, or the Jewish people, are a conquered people. And even though the Persians will let them go back and rebuild their temple, it's under the authority and the dominion of Persia. So I've mentioned Persia, last little slide here. The Persians come rolling in, roughly 60, 70 years or so after the rise of Nebuchadnezzar. And when the Babylonians went after the Assyrians in Nineveh, they went with a coalition. And so they were the leaders, and Nebuchadnezzar's family, actually his father, was principal in the story. But they also brought along other people groups, again, to think of the small city-states, to battle the Assyrians, again, who nobody liked the Assyrians. So it's pretty easy to do. It's kind of like when Napoleon goes after Russia, he calls for a national or European invasion. Hitler does the same thing. And people don't even realize, really, when you look at the German invasion of Russia in 41, it's multinational. And we could say that there are people who may have been forced, but at least the early 41, French forces, Spanish forces, Greek forces, Italian forces, other people groups, Romania, Hungary, they're fighting against the Russians. They're all kind of involved, and they're not there under duress. And we would say, why? Well, most people, at least historically at that point, didn't like Russia. Well, here they don't really like the Assyrians. And so the family of Nebuchadnezzar is successful in getting an alliance. And part of that alliance with the Persians and the Medes. Well, Cyrus becomes the dominant leader for Persia, and he will first deal with the Medes, so over in more towards the east of Iran. And then in the Battle of Opis, he will successfully defeat the Babylonians, and this will be the coming of Persia. So here's this last map to kind of close this out. And this is not all at once, just so we're clear, but the Persians will keep expanding our story. So if you think back up here in this upper area is where we had the Hittites, and then the Assyrians, there's Nineveh, kind of took over the northern part, kind of pressed down a little bit. The Babylonians then come and almost the whole Fertile Crescent. So you get to see them kind of controlling all the Tigris and Euphrates, kind of the whole of the coastline down into here. They defeated Egypt, hadn't conquered Egypt, right? The Babylonians, like the Assyrians, were like, we're the dominant player. And then now the Persians. And when I'm teaching the class, and this kind of what made me think what we would do in 2 weeks with you guys, this is when you obviously now make the step over into Greece. When we've taught our course, we've started here, we've looked at antiquity, we spent a couple of days looking at these ancient civilizations. Clearly, if we were doing a world history class, we'd go in a different direction, maybe. But now, what's obviously coming is the very famous clash between East and West. in the Greco-Persian War. We'll leave that for another time though, and we'll kind of wrap it up right there. Just kind of a glance through the peoples and civilizations of antiquity that we've been kind of looking at some of the aspects of them. And like I said, in a couple of weeks, we'll take next week off, but in a couple of weeks, when we come back in 2 weeks, my plan now, it may change, my plan now is to somewhat pick it up here and kind of just walk us through a chronology of what happens to these people groups. Because Persia, we're going to have with us for the rest of the story until we get to Alexander. And then Alexander is a representation, obviously, of the Macedonians. And then that's at the same time as the Romans. We saw the Romans and the Athenians were doing government at the same time. Well, what's happening with them kind of geopolitically? So we're not going to go in deep into detail of each one of those people groups, assuming we do this topic like I'm thinking. We'll kind of just pick up the story from right here. Thank you again, as always. Man, I cannot wait till I can physically be there with you and we can all gather again in Stover, because I want to ask you questions and I want to be able to answer questions you might have for me. Let me say it one more time. Please don't hesitate to email me through Becca or directly. I'd love to hear your questions or your thoughts if you have them. And if you have an idea of topics you want me to cover as the year goes on or into 2022, please let me know. I would love to try to work that out. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.